So I'd now like to invite the second team, which is from MetrixLab and Unilever, for their paper, Steering Through Rural India.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me loud and clear? Yeah. Okay. Firstly, it's lovely to be standing here talking about when we heard the term steering. I mean, I think the world's or amongst the world's largest heterogeneous audiences, the first thing that would come to mind for all of us would be rural India, right? It has a huge heterogeneity. And obviously, like I think there's been a tendency to approach it from the lens of, what will work in rural. And I think increasingly that narrative has moved to a point where now people are saying, okay, it's not what will work in one rural India, but what's going to happen across the many rural Indias that you see, right? And when we got this brief, and Nikita here, standing right here, was one of the key people there from Unilever, and we worked with Unilever on this, and there was a huge team which worked on the study. I'm going to take you through some of the, what we did, why it fits well in the topic, and why, we think it's a good fit for a paper, and we really enjoyed doing this piece here. So, the first thing, and this is hopefully the slide I really don't need to explain. It's probably a term which you've heard a lot, but what does it mean, right? What does a changing media landscape mean? It means access to people, to the rural woman. She's now able to look at content on her own, in her own space, right? And what are the implications of this? Traditional, let's say traditional media measurement has also always focused on what does the household look at? What is household level GRPs, right? Is there a shift that is necessary in this, right? And that was the kind of some of the ingoing hypothesis that we went in with at the time of the study. And when we came out, there were a lot of actions which convinced us that indeed that needs to shift, right? So when I talk about the changing media landscape, one of the key things we were trying to address is how do you address a change in mindset from household to an individual? And then the topic that we're talking about is steering, right? And I mentioned heterogeneity earlier. There are, I mean, rural in India is like, there are, like we went to over 500 villages here. One of the big parts was just getting it right. And you learn so much when you work on a project like this. I have to thank the MRSI for coming up with a topic like steering because like it was almost instinctive for us to say, okay, rural India has to go in there because talked about, going deep, right? And rural India is definitely a place to do that, right? It was a sample size of over 6,000 consumers. Thank you, Unilever, for making sure that we didn't try and do this with a small sample size. You need a large sample to just make sure you have the representation. And we started by essentially understanding what are the villages we should go to, and kind of came up with over 500 villages across 8 states in India. And these findings are for those 8 states. And I think at no point did we try to say, this needs to apply beyond as well. But they were very specific learnings, and Nikita will cover how the learnings were implemented and what actions came out of it. This is one of the most directly actionable studies which has come out from at least the work which I have done, and I'm very happy about that. And what did we do differently, right? Like, what do you do when you need to understand media, right? What is the individual consuming today? And I think the first thing, and this is already reflected in the way traditional media measurement is also reflected, is you can't just ask. You don't remember what you're consuming on your smartphone. Even right now, as I speak to you, people are consuming content. There is just too much content around, the smartphones around you. People have multiple screens. So a key thing, and this is very important, is it's important to ask people what they think they do, but it's also important to get a sense passively of what they are actually doing. So we clubbed the two things and we said, let's take an approach in which there was a survey where we asked them about their media habits, focusing more on what do they believe they're watching. And don't get me wrong, there are insights in that, right? You keep hearing there are insights in the say-do gap. This was an illustration of that, right? So what do people say they do? Versus the second bit was actually putting a passive tracking app into their phones to just measure at an aggregate level, in a fully GDPR compliant way, of course, what is it that people are consuming on their phones? What kind of apps are they using? What is the kind of content that they're viewing, right? And what was interesting was because we did the passive tracking on a subsample of the actual population, there were actual insights in the say-do ratio. And that in rural India was quite revealing for us that, we could pull that off, right? And the information areas, I'm not going to get into great detail. If you're trying to understand what people are watching, and therefore, how do you talk to them? How do you reach out to them? That list on the right gives you an idea of the kind of information areas you're interested in. You're interested in seeing how many smartphones are there in the house, how many of them are being shared, how many women are using their husband's smartphones, right? How frequently are these apps getting used? I'll show you one tidbit from there. Nikita will take you through some of the actions which kind of came through from the study, but I will show you a couple of small things which came through from there as well. How much is OTT penetration? All of those kind of questions. How much TV also are they watching in the house? Those were all there. But our focus was very much the individual. And we've changed some of these numbers, but they'll give you a good picture in terms of we were looking at what is viewership based reach, like how much reach do you get, and by each state where is it that TV and digital is playing a role. And I think the one thing I am going to leave behind in this room is digital was highly present in rural India, even more than we all thought it would be. And this was also getting ratified through passive kind of measurement. So we knew these people were using it, right? And like this kind of gives you some of the insights there which come through. This was, we started with a 300 slider, eventually got it down to 150, brought it down to 20 and things. So there was a lot of depth, as these studies always have, because you're basically getting into media, into each state and how the actionable things are different. But this gives you a kind of highlight of, where is TV higher, where is digital higher, amongst which segments is it higher there. This is a very interesting tidbit, and this kind of tells you why you need to think actively about what methods you use for research. This is coming from the passive data itself. Peak time, if you ask anybody, is going to be the evening, right? On TV, everybody knows what peak is. What we did see was a very interesting second peak, and this did not come through when we were doing it in the active survey. When you ask people, nobody figured that the time in rural India is when people were taking breaks, either from the field or going back home or all of that. Look at that smartphone usage there right in the middle of the screen, right? And this is one small tidbit of the kind of insights which we kind of got and we wouldn't have got without having passive in there. I'm gonna hand it over. Before I hand it over to Nikita, I'll just talk about the overall thing. This was by all means, a magnum opus, a huge study done over about 4 or 5 months before we landed it. I wish it was quicker, but it does take time. But this was not one of those pieces, we want to do quickly, but you want to do it well. The key areas we identified by steering through rural India were what states were ripe for media investment in digital, what kind of media vehicles do you use, what apps do you use, what's the right time of the day for advertising, how do you get to each of these populations, right? How do you win in the many Indias? And this study actually gave Unilever a huge sense of very specific actions on what they could take within rural India. And I'll hand it over to Nikita to cover some of the actions that came through from here.
Right. Yeah. So let me start at how we typically plan our media. We usually look for maximize our reach, and therefore TV ends up becoming a mainstream medium. However, what this study did is the typical approach of looking at households for reach. This study made a shift where we looked at media consumption from an individual level, and that's especially pertinent when we talk about digital. And this year, where we've increased our media spends, a sizable incremental spends actually have gone behind digital due to one big insight that we picked up, which is the exclusive digital viewership at an individual level is significant in rural. So that's the big one for us. Secondly, of course, YouTube is mainstream, but there were a lot of newer platforms like Moj, Takatak, YouTube, which were particularly emerging in certain states where we weren't investing, and we have started creating content and deploying on those platforms. That's point number 2. The third one was, I think we found very distinct consumption patterns when we looked at males and the young audience. For example, late night media consumption was big amongst males. Gaming was emerging amongst males, and I think brands that target males or brands that target young audience, these brands can differentially do things for rural India via digital. So that was a big direction for us. I think on high engagement platforms like YouTube, sponsored search ads through content creators, influencers was something that we started experimenting and really to then forge long-term relationships with influencers. Now, these were largely the business actions that we took. Most importantly, as a company, there is a big shift in the way we do rural. There is far more rigor when we do testing when it comes to wall paintings that we deploy in rural. So, case an example is in one of our divisions, all the wall paintings that go into rural are tested. And that's because what we picked up is overall recall of brands via wall paintings was very, very low. So some of the key insights that we got really has made us paradigm shift in the way we deploy in rural and the way we measure in rural. Yeah. For me, there were two big highlights of this study. One is, I think this whole element of passive listening, particularly when you go and measure media, it's not that easy. When you really want granular information on how media is consumed, I think there is a lot of claim element that comes in, and I think passive brought in that beauty because there were two things we did. We were able to truly corroborate the claim data with the data that we picked up through passive. Passive data ends up becoming very, very granular. So right from understanding the content to the time of the day that people consume data, we were able to get those level of insights. And really then when both of them come together, some of the very clear patterns that we picked up we were able to land with business very clearly because it's not just claim, but it's actually even passive data that has come in to corroborate it. And the second one is, yes, passive tracking is the first time that we did as a pilot. It is not easy because there are challenges in terms of getting permission for installation. A lot of people opt out of this whole agreement. However, overall, given that this is where the future is in terms of how we do research to capture media behavior, I think it is easy, it is okay, it is possible to overcome these challenges. Yeah, and three things that stand out for us. One is this was a pilot for us, the whole passive measurement piece, which was truly, truly successful. The second one was winning in many Indias. Measurement in rural is not easy. In fact, it's far more heterogeneous than what urban is. And here we were able to, of course, we had a liberty of a large sample size, so we were able to get a good geographic spread for our key markets. And I truly believe it was true representation of what each of the rural state was. And the third one is, yes, even in terms of how we measure media, as I said, from household to individual, that's the way it is going to be in future because digital is individual media consumption. And I think this study was able to truly adapt to that shift in terms of measurement.
So we have a question from the audience. How did you use the risk and tech appetite to understand and address the segments? How did you use the risk and tech appetite to understand and address the segments? Risk and tech appetite to understand and address the segments, the rural segment, I believe. Oh, okay.
There's another question.
My bad. What is your take on the penetration of e-com in India? Amazon, Flipkart, etc.
I can take it there. Yeah, as long as you can hear me. Yeah, so I mean, that was one of the areas which came through from the study. I think it's safe to say that in rural, I mean, there's also, by now, most people would have heard of Meesho, hopefully, but it's not just the Amazons and Flipkarts and the other things, but it's growing, it's still kind of small. So, I mean, I'm not talking about the exact numbers, but it's kind of growing in rural India, but it's still not like a massive kind of thing at an overall kind of level. These apps are there, but there are multiple kind of social shopping and things like that which you do observe, and it's only going in one direction, which is up, right? So.
Okay, thank you. That's all. Just a reminder to the audience to send in the questions only during the session.